January 17, 1961, the Oval Office. 3 days before he hands the presidency to a 43-year-old senator from Massachusetts. Dwight D. Eisenhower, the five-star general who led the Allied invasion of Europe and defeated Nazi Germany, looks into the camera and delivers the most important warning of his career. In the councils of government, he says, "We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military-industrial complex. The potential for the disastrous rise of misplaced power exists and will persist." The man who won World War II is telling America that its own government has become a threat to its own democracy, and 3 years later, the man who replaced him will be dead. Eisenhower's farewell address is one of the most quoted speeches in American history. But most people remember the phrase without understanding what he was actually warning about. He was not speaking in theory. He had watched a permanent war machine build itself inside the American government during his 8 years as president. He had fought it, and he knew he was losing. 3 years after this speech, President Kennedy would be assassinated. And the man Eisenhower had placed at the head of the CIA, Allen Dulles, would be fired by Kennedy and then appointed to investigate his murder. If this investigation changes how you see American history, subscribe now. Eisenhower's last days in office were shadowed by numbers. Few Americans truly grasped. When he took command of the presidency in 1953, the annual defense budget stood at $13 billion. By 1960, it had climbed to $47 billion, a more than threefold surge in just a decade. These were not just numbers on a ledger. They signaled a transformation. The United States, victorious in war, now kept itself on a permanent war footing, its factories and laboratories humming with the business of weapons and surveillance. Hidden inside these vast appropriations was a new kind of power. The CIA's funding, shielded from public view, was quietly woven into the Department of Defense's accounts. Classified as black or special funds, these lines escaped the scrutiny of ordinary congressional committees. In 1958, the agency's covert allocation reached over $70 million, up from just $2 million at the start of the decade. By 1960, the number was even higher. This secret financial engine gave the CIA the ability to run operations, fund front organizations, and build a global network, all without the kind of oversight that governed the rest of the federal government. Eisenhower understood what these numbers meant. He had authorized the buildup, believing it necessary to check Soviet expansion and hold together a fragile peace, but he also saw the risk. In one of the earliest drafts of his farewell address, dated December 21, 1960, his speechwriters included the phrase, military-industrial-congressional complex. The word congressional was cut from the final version, after advisors warned it would provoke a backlash from lawmakers who controlled the budget. The warning was softened, but the meaning remained. Power had begun to slip beyond the reach of ordinary checks and balances. The press covered the speech as a curiosity, a general warning about defense contractors and generals. But the numbers Eisenhower cited were not abstract. $13 billion to $47 billion. Hidden budgets, secret appropriations. The architecture of secrecy was now built into the very machinery of government. If this investigation changes how you see American power, hit that like button. If you are following this investigation, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, Eisenhower insisted, could keep this machine in check. In August 1953, the world watched Iran but didn't see the invisible hand guiding its fate. Deep inside the CIA, Allen Dulles signed off on Operation Ajax, a plan to topple Prime Minister Mohammad Mossadegh and restore the Shah to power. The operation drew on the new black budget, funneling secret funds into Tehran to pay off street gangs, bribe officials, and flood the airwaves with propaganda. British intelligence played its part, but it was Dulles's team that orchestrated the chaos. By August 19th, Mossadegh was gone. The Shah, once a shaky exile, returned to rule. Declassified CIA files later called it a major victory. Oil flowed west again, and the agency's confidence surged. Less than a year later, the blueprint was dusted off for Guatemala. In June 1954, Operation PBS Success launched against President Jacobo Arbenz. This time, The CIA trained a small army of exiles in Honduras, ran a psychological war campaign, and paid local media to spread fear of communist takeover. On June 27th, Arbenz resigned under pressure. The United States installed a new regime friendly to Washington and American business. The files reveal a playbook: covert funding, staged unrest, and rapid regime change, all without a single U.S. soldier in uniform crossing the border. Allen Dulles moved through these victories with quiet certainty. The agency's success in Iran and Guatemala cemented his reputation as the architect of modern covert action. He briefed Eisenhower directly, promising that these operations could contain communism without the costs or scrutiny of open war. The CIA's budget, shielded from public view, now funded not just intelligence, but the overthrow of governments. If this investigation changes how you see American power, hit that like button. These coups became the template for future action, a template that would soon face its greatest test in Cuba. Allen Dulles took the helm of the CIA on February 26, 1953, stepping into an office with more autonomy and more secrecy than any American intelligence chief before him. The National Security Act had given the agency a mandate for covert action, but Dulles expanded that mandate into a global enterprise. He convinced the White House that intelligence required its own protected stream of money, invisible to the public and even to most members of Congress. By 1958, the CIA's black budget had soared past $70 million, hidden within the broader defense appropriation. These funds were not just for gathering secrets. They purchased foreign newspapers, hired exiles, paid for arms, and propped up front companies on every continent. Dulles reported directly to the president, but in practice, his agency operated with a level of independence that rivaled any cabinet department. The fiscal ledgers from this era show a swelling current of money flowing into operations that only a handful of people in Washington ever fully understood. The 1960 planning documents for Cuba, labeled General Covert Action Plan for Cuba, outlined a mission to train, arm, and land Cuban exiles on the southern coast to overthrow Fidel Castro. This was not a military campaign run by the Pentagon. It was a clandestine invasion, funded and orchestrated by the CIA, approved at the highest levels, but insulated from the usual checks and balances. The Bay of Pigs scheme was conceived in the shadows, its budget lines scattered across multiple accounts to avoid detection. Dulles's confidence came not just from past coups in Iran and Guatemala, but from the agency's new fiscal muscle. The CIA could now field armies, run psychological warfare campaigns, and shape foreign governments, all without a single public debate. If this investigation changes how you see American power, hit that like button. If you are following this investigation, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. As the invasion plan moved forward in 1960, the agency's leaders believed they could pull the strings of foreign policy with the same impunity they had enjoyed in the previous decade. The machinery Eisenhower had built, the secret budgets, the global network, the doctrine of plausible deniability had taken on a life of its own. The next president would soon discover just how hard it was to control. Inside the CIA's headquarters, Allen Dulles signed off on projects that blurred the line between national defense and something far darker. In April 1953, the agency launched MK Ultra, a secret program aimed at unlocking the secrets of mind control. Scientists working under contract dosed unwitting Americans with LSD, hypnotized test subjects, and experimented with sensory deprivation, all in the name of finding ways to break and remake the human mind. The program's files, later forced into the open by congressional hearings, document payments to front organizations and universities with results that ranged from bizarre to tragic. Some subjects never knew what had happened to them. Others suffered lasting psychological harm. The project ran for 20 years, shielded by classified budgets and a culture of secrecy that treated oversight as a nuisance. Dulles's willingness to push boundaries did not stop at the laboratory door. In October 1960, a classified memo outlined a plan that reads today like something from a crime novel. Enlist the American mafia to help assassinate Fidel Castro. The agency's own files confirm that meetings were held with mobsters Sam Giancana and Santos Trafficante. The CIA supplied poison pills, cash and safe houses, hoping organized crime could succeed where the agency's own operatives had failed. The plot never reached its goal, but the paper trail remains, evidence that the agency was prepared to make common cause with criminals to remove a foreign leader. These operations unfolded with almost no external scrutiny. The black budget, hidden in Defense Department accounts, paid for experiments and assassination plots alike. Congressional committees received sanitized briefings, if any at all. Dulles reported directly to the president, but few in Washington knew the full extent of what the agency was doing. The culture inside the CIA, shaped by Dulles's vision, prized autonomy and secrecy above all else. The agency's leaders believed they were defending the country by any means necessary, even if that meant crossing ethical and legal lines that would have been unthinkable just a decade earlier. If this investigation changes how you see American power, hit that like button. If you are following this investigation, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, Eisenhower warned, can keep this machine in check. April 17, 1961. Before dawn, a force of 1,400 Cuban exiles, trained and armed by the CIA, landed at Playa Girón on Cuba's southern coast. The plan, conceived in secrecy, funded by hidden budget lines, and signed off by Allen Dulles, was to topple Fidel Castro's government in a matter of days. But the operation unraveled almost instantly. Cuban forces, forewarned and better equipped than the CIA had predicted, pinned down the invaders on the beach. U.S. air support, promised in the planning stages, never arrived. Within 72 hours, more than 1,000 men were captured. The world watched as the United States was humiliated on the international stage. Inside the White House, President Kennedy was furious. The CIA had assured him the plan would succeed, that Castro's regime would collapse under pressure and the Cuban people would rise up. Instead, the president faced the fallout of a failed invasion and the exposure of America's secret war. In a private diary entry dated May 3, 1961, Kennedy wrote words that would echo for decades. He wanted to splinter the CIA into 1,000 pieces and scatter it to the winds. Whether he ever intended to go that far, the sentiment was clear. He no longer trusted the agency that had led him into disaster. The rupture was immediate and public. Kennedy took responsibility for the failure, but behind closed doors, he blamed the CIA's leadership for misleading him, for operating with too much autonomy and too little accountability. The Bay of Pigs was not just a military defeat, it was a shattering of confidence between the president and his intelligence chiefs. The machinery Eisenhower warned about, powerful, secretive, and insulated from oversight, had proven itself uncontrollable. If this investigation changes how you see American power, hit that like button. If you are following this investigation, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry, Eisenhower had said, can keep this machine in check. On April 25, 1961, President Kennedy summoned Allen Dulles to the Oval Office and accepted his resignation as Director of Central Intelligence. The Bay of Pigs disaster had exposed a dangerous gap between the agency's power and the president's control, a gap Eisenhower had warned about in his farewell address just months earlier. Dulles, who had shaped the CIA into a global force for covert action, was now out. Alongside him, Deputy Director Charles Cabell and Senior Planner Richard Bissell were also dismissed. Kennedy's move was more than personal retribution. It was a public act of accountability, unprecedented for an agency that had operated in the shadows since its founding. But Kennedy did not stop at firings. On July 19, 1961, he signed National Security Action Memorandum 57, or NSAM 57. The directive stripped the CIA of its authority to conduct large-scale paramilitary operations, transferring that power to the Department of Defense. The text of NSAM 57 is blunt. Covert military actions would now require presidential approval and Pentagon oversight. For the first time, the machinery of covert war faced a new check, one that echoed Eisenhower's call for an alert and knowledgeable citizenry to keep the machinery of defense in balance with democratic goals. Yet the wounds inside the intelligence community did not heal. In a 1962 interview, Dulles dismissed Kennedy as "that little Kennedy," sneering that the president thought he was a god. The remark captures a deeper resentment that simmered beneath the surface. Dulles believed the presidency was temporary, but the agency he built would endure. The architecture of secrecy and autonomy Eisenhower had tried to warn about was not dismantled. It was simply forced to adapt. If this investigation changes how you see American power, hit that like button. If you are following this investigation, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of military power with peaceful goals. The struggle between president and agency was not over. It was only entering a new, more ominous phase. November 22, 1963. Shots ring out in Dallas. President John F. Kennedy is pronounced dead at 1:00 p.m. Central Time. Within 48 hours, President Johnson orders a formal investigation. On December 8, 1963, Allen Dulles, recently fired by Kennedy for the Bay of Pigs disaster, raises his right hand and is sworn in as a commissioner. The man who had run the CIA as a state within a state, who had briefed presidents and toppled governments, now sits at the center of the inquiry into Kennedy's murder. Historian Stephen Kinzer describes this as a paradox almost beyond belief. The architect of covert power, now charged with uncovering the truth about the death of the president who removed him. If this investigation changes how you see American history, subscribe now. Eisenhower's farewell address closed with words that still echo. Only an alert and knowledgeable citizenry can compel the proper meshing of the huge industrial and military machinery of defense with our peaceful methods and goals. He had seen the machinery from the inside, as a general and as president, and knew its momentum could outlast any one leader. The warning was sharpened by what he left unsaid. Early drafts called it the military-industrial-congressional complex, but the word congressional was cut before the speech went public, softening the blow to lawmakers who controlled the purse strings. Yet the fear remained. That power, once hidden and unchecked, could slip beyond the reach of democracy. 2 years after Eisenhower's warning, Harry Truman, the president who signed the CIA into existence, published an op-ed in the Washington Post. He called for the agency to be dismantled, warning that secret government was a danger to the republic. These were not partisan attacks, but alarms sounded by men who built the system. If this investigation changes how you see American power, hit that like button. If you are following this investigation, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. Not every scholar agrees that Eisenhower's warning was aimed at the intelligence community. In 2009, a Harvard historian argued that the farewell address was directed mainly at the rise of defense contractors and the Pentagon, not the CIA or secret agencies. The phrase military-industrial complex, they point out, never directly mentions intelligence or covert action. According to this view, Eisenhower's real concern was the unchecked growth of weapons manufacturing and the influence of military spending on Congress. The debate endures. Was the warning about the shadow world of covert power, or only the visible machinery of war? If this investigation changes how you see American history, subscribe now. Eisenhower's warning wasn't just about tanks and missiles, it was about power moving in the shadows, unchecked. 3 years later, the same man Kennedy fired from the CIA led the investigation into his murder. Today, intelligence agencies shape global policy with little public scrutiny. The question remains, can an alert and knowledgeable citizenry restrain misplaced power from within? If you're following this investigation, hit subscribe and turn on notifications. You decide.